I have learned that sometimes the most perfect revenge is not destroying your opponents with violence. Instead, you let them step into the exact pit their own boundless greed dug while you stand at the edge calmly looking down. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you love satisfying endings where justice is sharply served, hit follow and subscribe to Revenge Stories. Do not miss the psychological twists in our upcoming episodes. Goodbye. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Mia Rogers. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior risk analyst at Aegis Horizon Analytics. Today I stood entirely alone in the center of a blindingly bright, excessively modern law office in downtown Seattle. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline, but the harsh morning sunlight pouring into the room offered no warmth whatsoever. It only served to illuminate the glaring, painful contrast between the world I practically scraped by in and the opulent world my estranged family inhabited. We were gathered together for the official reading of the last will and testament of my grandfather, Arthur Rogers. Sitting directly across the massive glass table from me were my mother Beatrice and my older brother Preston. They occupied a plush imported leather sofa, as if it were a royal throne radiating their usual suffocating aura of absolute arrogance. Beatrice continuously adjusted her designer silk scarf, her posture rigid and unyielding, while Preston aggressively and rhythmically tapped his polished custom-made leather shoe against the pristine mahogany floor. Neither of them made the slightest effort to hide their mounting impatience. Every few seconds, Preston would raise his wrist to check his wildly expensive smartwatch, sighing heavily and dramatically, while Beatrice mindlessly scrolled through her phone screen. They were not here to mourn the loss of the family patriarch. They were practically vibrating with the greedy anticipation of completely taking over Rogers Aerodynamics, the colossal, industry-defining aviation technology corporation my grandfather had built entirely from the ground up. The lawyer, a sharp-featured man with a terribly monotone voice, cleared his throat dryly and began to read the final declarations. The air in the room grew completely still, heavy with expectation. According to the lengthy legal document, Preston was to receive full operational control and 100% of the controlling shares of the corporation. Beatrice was seamlessly handed the sprawling multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate portfolio, securing her a guaranteed life of endless carefree luxury. The lawyer droned on for what felt like 45 excruciating minutes, painstakingly listing off luxury properties, hidden offshore accounts, and massive stock options. Finally, he paused, looking up from his remarkably thick stack of papers. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and looked directly into my eyes. With a slow, almost pitying movement, he reached under his massive desk and pulled out a small, incredibly battered wooden box. He slid it across the smooth glass table toward me. While Preston and Beatrice had just effortlessly inherited a global empire, I was being given this mysterious piece of junk. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly despite my best efforts to maintain composure, and unclasped the rusted brass latch. The hinges creaked, a dry, agonizing sound in the deadly quiet room. Inside the faded velvet-lined interior lay a heavy metal pilot's watch. It was clearly a forgotten relic from the 1960s. The leather strap was completely rotted away. The heavy metal casing was violently scratched, and the glass face was fractured into a complex spiderweb of deep, jagged cracks. The hands were frozen in place, completely lifeless. It was entirely broken. The tense silence in the room was suddenly shattered by a sharp, ugly snort. Preston leaned back heavily in his chair, clapping his hands together slowly, as a malicious, victorious grin spread across his face. His laughter echoed loudly off the glass walls, harsh and intentionally humiliating. "Well, well," Preston sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at the wooden box in my hands. It seems that even in death, grandfather still knew exactly who the useless one was in this family. Beatrice offered a cold, highly satisfied smirk, not even bothering to reprimand him for his cruelty. She simply went back to examining her perfectly painted fingernails. I stood there staring down at the ruined watch, violently forcing myself to swallow the heavy, suffocating knot of humiliation and grief rising rapidly in my throat. I clenched my jaw so tightly, my teeth physically ached. My mind flashed back through the dark tunnel of the last 15 years of my life. I vividly remembered the endless, exhausting days and nights after my family abruptly and mercilessly cut me off financially. I remembered working 3 grueling minimum-wage jobs just to pay my university tuition, studying until 2 or 3 in the morning, until my eyes blurred, and eventually clawing my way up the unforgiving corporate ladder at Aegis Horizon Analytics with absolute zero help from anyone. Meanwhile, Preston, a man whose sheer undeniable incompetence was a running joke throughout the entire aviation industry, was handed every major promotion, every massive bonus, and every golden opportunity on a silver platter. The red carpet was always rolled out for him, effectively shielding him from his own catastrophic multi-million-dollar failures. They fully expected me to cry right then and there. They wanted me to beg or scream or desperately demand a rational explanation. Instead, I carefully closed the lid of the old wooden box and picked it up with a steady hand. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not utter a single word in response to Preston's pathetic taunts. I turned my back on the two of them, my spine perfectly straight, and walked steadily toward the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open and stepped out of the office permanently, leaving the suffocating smell of their unearned wealth behind me. I walked alone through the bustling, rain-slicked Seattle streets, tightly clutching the small wooden box to my chest, and eventually took the city bus back to my cramped, dimly lit apartment. Sitting heavily on the edge of my worn-out mattress, I opened the box again and stared blankly at the cracked glass of the old pilot's watch. At that exact moment, wrapped in the quiet isolation of my tiny room, I was absolutely convinced of one simple, devastating fact. I had been completely and permanently erased from the Rogers family. 3 days dragged by in a blur of gray Seattle rain. It was a Tuesday, slightly past 11 o'clock at night. The city was swallowed by a thick, suffocating fog and a relentless, freezing drizzle that tapped continuously against the single pane of thin glass in my living room. I sat in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, trying to lose myself in risk assessment algorithms. My apartment complex was situated in one of the least desirable neighborhoods, a place where the streetlights flickered and died, and the sounds of sirens were a nightly lullaby. Outside, the low, powerful hum of heavy engines rumbled through the quiet street, vibrating against the cracked foundation of the building. I glanced through the damp blinds. Down below, idling silently, next to the overflowing dumpsters, was a convoy of 3 massive, pitch-black, armored sport utility vehicles. They looked entirely alien against the backdrop of crumbling brick and rusted fire escapes. The headlights were dead, but the engines purred with a predatory menace. A heavy silence descended over the hallway outside my door. Then 3 sharp, dry knocks echoed through my cramped living space. The sound was not hesitant. It was a command. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I did not have visitors, certainly not at this hour, and certainly not anyone who traveled in a tactical convoy. I walked slowly toward the door, my bare feet quiet against the cheap peeling linoleum floor. I peered through the scratched peephole. Standing in the dim yellow glow of the hallway light was a man who commanded absolute authority before he even spoke a word. I undid the deadbolt and pulled the door open, the rusty hinges whining in protest. The man towering in my doorway was dressed in the immaculate, razor-sharp dress uniform of the United States Air Force. 4 solid silver stars gleamed heavily on his shoulders, catching the weak hallway light. His face was a map of deep weathered lines carved by decades of high-stakes pressure and classified decisions. His eyes, dark and sharp as newly forged razor blades, locked onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel instantly thinner. He did not look at the water damage on my ceiling. He did not look at the stack of unpaid utility bills on the small table by the door. He looked only at me. He stepped smoothly over the threshold, his polished black shoes making no sound on the worn carpet. The sheer physical presence of the man seemed to shrink my already tiny apartment, pressing in on the walls. He stood at perfect attention, his posture radiating a rigid, unbreakable discipline. "Mia Rogers," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the space entirely. "Senior Risk Analyst at Aegis Horizon Analytics." It was not a question. It was a highly calculated statement of fact delivered to let me know that he possessed a complete unredacted file on my entire existence. I swallowed the lump of anxiety forming in my throat and stood my ground, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "Who are you?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I am General Marcus Thorne," he replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. "And I am here for the item Arthur Rogers left in your possession." A wave of profound exhaustion washed over me. The watch. I let out a bitter, tired sigh. I turned my back on the 4-star general, walked the 3 short steps into my cramped kitchen, and yanked open the top drawer next to the sink. The cheap wooden box sat there exactly where I had shoved it the moment I walked in the door. I grabbed it, flipped the rusted brass latch, and pulled out the heavy, ruined piece of metal. I walked back into the living room and held the broken pilot's watch out toward him, dangling it slightly by the frayed edges of the rotted leather strap. I fully intended to toss it directly into his impeccably clean hands like the worthless scrap metal it was. I wanted it gone. "Take it," I said, my voice dripping with cold resentment. "It does not work. The glass is shattered, the gears are rusted shut, and the hands have not moved in decades. If the military wants to reclaim a piece of garbage, be my guest." General Thorne did not reach for the watch. He did not even flinch. Instead, he took one slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the object in my hand. His sharp eyes narrowed, shifting from the shattered glass face up to my confused expression. The heavy silence in the room stretched out taut and fragile before he finally spoke. His voice dropped an entire octave, losing the formal military crispness and taking on a deeply guarded, almost conspiratorial weight. "You still have not opened the back of it, have you?" I stood perfectly still. My breathing stopped. The words hung in the freezing air of my apartment, fundamentally altering gravity. I slowly pulled my hand back, bringing the heavy metal casing closer to my chest. I looked down at the ruined surface, then back up at the general. "Open it," Thorne instructed, his voice low and tight. "Run your thumb exactly along the bottom edge of the casing, just below the rusted, winding crown. There is a hairline fracture hidden beneath the grime." My fingers were trembling now, but not from the cold. I gripped the heavy metal firmly. Following his exact instructions, I pressed my thumb hard against the rough, oxidized steel near the bottom edge. I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible groove. I pushed against it with my fingernail. There was a sharp mechanical click that sounded deafening in the quiet room. The entire back plate of the watch instantly popped loose, releasing a faint puff of trapped stale air. I carefully peeled the metal disc away. I expected to see a tangled mess of broken springs, tiny brass gears, and dead machinery. Instead, the entire internal cavity of the watch was completely hollowed out. Nestled perfectly in the center of a custom-molded, shock-absorbent synthetic polymer casing was a sleek black micro SD card. It was so small, yet it sat there radiating an invisible, terrifying gravity. I tilted the metal back plate toward the weak light filtering in from the hallway. There, etched into the inside of the steel cover with a microscopic, high-precision laser, were lines of complex text and numbers. They were precise, undeniable global positioning system coordinates. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. My grandfather had not left me a broken piece of trash. He had left me a weapon. I stared at the tiny black square of the micro SD card, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer impossibility of what I was looking at. General Thorne moved toward my small kitchen table, pulling out one of the rickety wooden chairs. He gestured for me to sit down. I did my legs feeling like lead. Your grandfather was known to the public as a pioneer in commercial aviation. Thorne began, his voice taking on the sharp, clinical cadence of an intelligence briefing. But that was merely his daytime cover. For over 3 decades, Arthur Rogers was one of the most heavily classified tactical engineers on the Department of Defense payroll. I looked up at him stunned. A classified engineer. Thorne nodded once. He designed stealth telemetry systems for black site operations. 30 years ago, during a highly sensitive technology extraction mission deep in hostile territory, my extraction team was compromised. We were pinned down, communications were completely jammed, and our operational window was collapsing rapidly. Arthur was back in command control. He bypassed 3 separate layers of military encryption, rerouted a satellite link using a patch signal, and manually guided my team through a blind extraction corridor. He saved the lives of 14 operators that night. I owe him my life. Thorne leaned forward, placing his large hands flat on the table. Arthur possessed a brilliant calculating mind. He also possessed a terrifyingly clear vision of the future. He watched your brother Preston grow into a man driven entirely by greed, entitlement, and a staggering lack of competence. Arthur knew that if Preston ever gained true control over the bleeding-edge technology developed within Rogers Aerodynamics, it would be a catastrophic disaster. I carefully set the hollowed-out watch casing down on the table. "So what is on this drive?" I asked, pointing to the tiny black card. "The weapon he forged to stop him," Thorne replied instantly. "That drive contains the absolute legal architecture of a ghost corporation, a highly fortified shell company named Iron Sight LLC. You see, Mia, the colossal empire that your mother and brother believe they just inherited, is nothing more than a hollowed-out legal fiction. Every single proprietary algorithm, every next-generation turbine blueprint, and every core patent that makes Rogers Aerodynamics a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut does not actually belong to the Rogers Family Trust." My eyes widened as the realization hit me. They belong to Iron Sight. "Exactly," Thorne confirmed. "Rogers Aerodynamics has merely been leasing the exclusive licensing rights from Iron Sight for the past 20 years. And exactly 5 years ago, anticipating his own declining health and Preston's inevitable power grab, your grandfather executed a blind, irrevocable transfer of assets. He legally transferred 100% of the ownership and executive control of Iron Sight LLC directly to you. It was buried under mountains of corporate shielding, waiting for this exact moment." My breath caught in my throat. I owned the technology. I owned the very foundation that Preston's newfound empire was built upon. If I pulled the licenses, Rogers Aerodynamics would instantly become a worthless pile of empty warehouses and office buildings. "But there is a complication," Thorne said, his tone growing distinctly darker. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a startling revelation to an active, immediate threat. "I am not standing in your living room in the middle of the night solely to deliver an inheritance and repay an old debt, Ms. Rogers. I am here because we are facing an imminent Tier 1 national security crisis." I leaned back in my chair, my risk analyst instincts immediately flaring up. "What did Preston do?" "He accumulated debt," Thorne stated coldly. "Massive, insurmountable underground gambling debt. Over the last 4 years, Preston has leveraged himself to the brink of total ruin through illegal high-stakes syndicates operating out of Macau and Eastern Europe. He owes roughly $45 million to people who do not negotiate." I shook my head in disgust. $45 million. Of course he does. And he plans to use the company to pay it off. "Worse," Thorne corrected sharply. "He cannot simply liquidate corporate assets without triggering federal oversight. Instead, our Signals Intelligence Division intercepted communications 48 hours ago. Preston is currently in the final stages of a secret backdoor negotiation. He intends to sell a controlling stake in Rogers Aerodynamics, along with unrestricted access to its military-grade aerospace patents, to a shadow defense contractor based in a hostile nation. A contractor with heavily documented financial ties to recognized global terrorist networks." The blood drained completely from my face. Preston was not just a greedy, arrogant fool. He was actively committing treason. To save his own pathetic skin, he was willing to hand over highly classified American aviation technology to the highest bidder on the black market. If this clandestine merger goes through, Thorne continued, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. The strategic advantage of the United States Air Force will be compromised for the next 2 decades. We cannot move against him openly yet. If the Department of Justice raids the corporate headquarters right now, Preston's foreign handlers will immediately scrub the servers, vaporize the money trail, and vanish into the shadows. We will lose our only chance to dismantle their network. Thorne stood up to his full towering height, looking down at me. Your grandfather knew your analytical mind, Mia. He knew your resilience. He armed you with this technology because he trusted you to use it when the time came. You are no longer the outcast of the Rogers family. You are the sole executive officer of Ironsight LLC, and you are the only person on this earth currently holding the kill switch to completely destroy your brother's empire before he sells this country out. I looked away from the general and stared at the tiny micro SD card resting on the battered table. The suffocating weight of my family's betrayal, the years of grinding poverty, and the bitter humiliation in the lawyer's office collided violently with the staggering reality of my new power. I was holding the absolute destruction of Preston Rogers between my fingertips. I looked at General Thorne and shook my head. A lesser person, someone driven purely by blind rage and the sudden intoxication of absolute power, would have immediately contacted a team of aggressive corporate lawyers. They would have rushed into the boardroom, waving the newly discovered legal documents in the air to publicly claim their rightful throne. But I was a senior risk analyst. My entire career was built on calculating hidden variables, anticipating catastrophic failures, and methodically dismantling severe threats before they even fully materialized. I refused to act on reckless impulse. If I simply pulled the plug on the patents right now, Preston would panic. He would desperately scramble, destroy the digital evidence of his illegal international negotiations, and easily slither away from the heavy treason charges, leaving the company in complete ruins, but successfully saving his own skin. No, I told the general, my voice steady and exceptionally cold. We do not call the authorities right now. We do not freeze the corporate accounts. If we strike at this exact moment, he simply looks like an incompetent chief executive officer who lost a complex legal battle over intellectual property. We need him to step completely and willingly into the snare. We need to let him believe he has won absolutely everything, so he freely commits his treason on the permanent record. Thorne lowered his head slightly, his sharp eyes gleaming with a dangerous, deeply approving light. What is your primary parameter for engagement? I need direct physical access to his internal network servers, I replied, my mind already rapidly building the architectural framework of the trap. I need to map the exact digital flow of his dirty money, track the offshore encrypted communications, and secure hard copies of the foreign merger contracts. To do that, I need to be inside the building. I need to be completely invisible to them. 2 days later, I stood in the massive marble-floored lobby of the corporate headquarters. I deliberately wore a slightly faded, poorly ironed gray blouse and an old, heavily scuffed pair of sensible black shoes. I had purposefully skipped applying any makeup, allowing the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes to show, clearly projecting an image of total, crushing defeat. I took the private glass elevator up to the executive penthouse suite, my stomach churning violently, not from fear, but from the sheer physical effort of suppressing my immense disgust. I walked slowly into the opulent corner office. Preston was lounging lazily behind a massive mahogany desk, practicing his golf swing with a titanium putter, while my mother, Beatrice, sat gracefully on a white leather sofa, sipping imported sparkling water from a crystal glass. Well, Preston sneered loudly, pausing his swing and leaning heavily on the silver putter, if it is not the prodigal sister. Did you come here to ask for a desperate loan against that worthless piece of junk grandfather left you? I forced my shoulders to slump forward, staring blankly down at the plush, expensive carpet. I channeled every single ounce of the profound exhaustion I had felt over the last 15 years and weaponized it instantly. I am completely bankrupt, Preston, I said, my voice trembling, perfectly portraying absolute despair. My landlord is officially evicting me next week. I have drowning credit card debt from medical bills I could not pay last year. Aegis Horizon Analytics fired me yesterday because I missed too many shifts dealing with the estate legalities. I have absolutely nothing left. I looked up, meeting his arrogant, mocking gaze with carefully manufactured desperation. Please, I just need a job. Any job at all. I will do anything you ask. I just need to be able to pay my rent so I'm not sleeping on the street. Beatrice let out a sharp, exceptionally cold laugh, setting her glass down on the glass table. You always were a highly dramatic, pathetic creature, Mia. Crawling right back here the second the real world proved too difficult for you to handle. Preston, however, was practically glowing with dark excitement. His eyes widened with sadistic, unadulterated joy. The absolute power dynamic he had always desperately craved over me was finally real. He walked slowly around the heavy desk, standing uncomfortably close to me, thoroughly relishing his supposed dominance. Anything? He asked, a cruel, ugly smile stretching widely across his face. You will do absolutely anything. Yes, I whispered softly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Excellent. Preston clapped his hands together loudly, the sound echoing like a gunshot. We just fired the junior administrative assistant on the 4th floor. It is mostly mindless filing, fetching my daily dry cleaning, and making sure my morning coffee is exactly 180 degrees. The pay is strict minimum wage, and you report directly to me. Welcome to the family business, Mia. The next 3 weeks were a grueling masterclass in psychological endurance. Preston exploited my presence in the building with a truly pathological enthusiasm. He purposefully scheduled high-level executive meetings just so he could buzz his intercom and summon me to the grand boardroom simply to pour ice water or wipe down the whiteboards. He would intentionally introduce me to visiting dignitaries and rival chief executive officers as his tragically incompetent little sister, a pathetic charity case he kept around purely out of the supreme goodness of his heart. The absolute worst of it came when the foreign defense contractors finally arrived at the Seattle headquarters. These were the highly dangerous shadow operatives General Thorne had explicitly warned me about. They wore expensive, impeccably tailored suits, but their eyes were completely dead, calculating, and ruthless. During a critical, highly classified closed-door strategy session, Preston buzzed my desk and loudly demanded I bring a tray of fresh coffee. I walked quietly into the room carrying a heavy silver tray. As I leaned over politely to place a porcelain cup in front of the lead foreign negotiator, Preston intentionally shoved his elbow backward, hitting my arm hard. The scalding black coffee spilled aggressively across the man's saucer and splashed directly onto my skirt. You clumsy idiot! Preston snapped viciously, his voice echoing sharply in the quiet, tense room. He looked at the foreign contractors and rolled his eyes dramatically, sighing heavily. I deeply apologize for her sheer clumsiness, gentlemen. Good help is entirely impossible to find, especially when you are forced to hire useless family members out of sheer pity. Clean this mess up immediately and get out of my sight, Mia. I grabbed a handful of white napkins, frantically scrubbing the spilled coffee off the expensive mahogany table, while the men looked down at me with absolute, undisguised contempt. I kept my face entirely blank, apologizing profusely, my voice small and properly pathetic. But behind my submissive, fearful posture, my eyes were actively scanning the confidential documents spread across the table. I rapidly memorized the foreign letterheads, the international banking routing numbers, and the heavily redacted executive signatures. I was not the victim in that room. I was the apex predator, calmly and methodically studying the exact anatomy of my prey. The daily humiliation was merely a highly effective smokescreen. Every single night, long after the executives had gone home to their luxury penthouses, I stayed late in my tiny windowless cubicle on the 4th floor, supposedly organizing decades of old, entirely irrelevant tax files. In reality, I was plunging deep into the corporate digital mainframe. Using the highly sophisticated digital footprint tracking techniques I had mastered at my previous firm, I easily bypassed Preston's laughably weak administrative firewalls. He was a deeply arrogant man who spent millions of dollars on physical security guards, but used his own birth year as his primary master administrative password. It was almost insulting how incredibly easy it was to break him wide open. Over the course of 21 days, I systematically extracted absolutely everything. I found the hidden, deeply encrypted digital ledgers documenting his staggering $45 million in underground gambling debt. I quietly intercepted the secure email chains, definitively confirming the illegal transfer of restricted military patents to the shadow shell company owned by the foreign contractors. I successfully downloaded the final unedited drafts of the corporate merger agreement, proving undeniably that Preston was actively selling out the national security of the United States simply to save himself from international loan sharks. I compiled every single piece of damning data onto a highly secure encrypted drive and passed it directly to General Thorne during brief, entirely silent meetings in various underground city parking garages. The federal intelligence agencies were quietly and rapidly building an airtight, completely impenetrable cage of federal indictments around my brother entirely based on the raw evidence I continually provided. Simultaneously, I initiated the fatal legal protocols. Working entirely in the shadows, I filed the necessary legally irreversible paperwork through an anonymous proxy attorney to officially activate the patent revocation clause hidden deep within the Ironsight Limited Liability Company charter. I set the legal execution date to align perfectly with Preston's upcoming grand finale. The invisible explosive charges were now perfectly planted at every single structural pillar of his fake stolen empire. All I had to do now was wait patiently for him to light the match. The grand ballroom of the Grand Crest Hotel, the most exclusive five-star establishment in Seattle, was transformed into a dazzling theater of corporate arrogance. It was 8 o'clock on a Friday evening. A massive, glittering crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the room, illuminating tables draped in expensive white silk and centerpieces overflowing with imported white roses. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos circulated silently, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne that cost well over $500 a bottle. At the very front of the expansive room, a raised stage had been constructed backed by a massive high-definition digital display, currently glowing with the gilded logo of Rogers Aerodynamics. This was the victory lap, the official signing ceremony for a $1 billion corporate merger. Preston stood proudly at the platinum podium, practically vibrating with a sickening, self-righteous euphoria. He wore a custom-tailored Italian tuxedo that cost more than my entire college tuition. Beside him stood Beatrice, draped tightly in a stunning emerald green designer gown, heavy diamond earrings pulling at her earlobes. She smiled brightly for the flashing cameras of the hired corporate photographers. Seated comfortably at the long, polished mahogany table on the stage were the foreign defense contractors, their faces pulled into tight, expectant smiles as they watched their geopolitical coup materialize. Preston tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing sound instantly commanded the attention of the packed room. A hush fell over the crowd of corrupt executives, bought-off politicians, and oblivious shareholders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art acoustic system, dripping with false humility. "Tonight, we are not just finalizing a highly lucrative business transaction. We are cementing a historic global partnership. This monumental $1 billion agreement ensures that Rogers Aerodynamics will continue to dominate the international skies for the next 50 years. It is a testament to my personal vision and to the enduring legacy of the Rogers family." He reached triumphantly into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a solid gold fountain pen. He turned toward the heavy leather-bound merger contract resting on the mahogany table. The foreign lead negotiator leaned forward eagerly, his eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. Preston lowered the gold nib toward the signature line. "Put the pen down, Preston." My voice did not boom through the sound system, but it sliced cleanly through the dead silence of the ballroom like a freshly sharpened guillotine blade. Every single head in the room snapped instantly toward the massive, intricately carved double doors at the back of the hall. I stood perfectly still in the threshold. I was no longer the hunched, pathetic administrative assistant wearing cheap, stained blouses. I wore a razor-sharp, perfectly tailored midnight blue power suit. My posture was rigid, my chin held high, and my eyes locked onto my brother with the focused, chilling intensity of an apex predator that had finally cornered its prey. Preston froze the gold pen hovering a mere inch above the paper. His face contorted rapidly from absolute shock to vicious, unrestrained fury. "What in the world are you doing here?" Preston snarled, abandoning his charming public persona instantly. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Security, grab this deranged woman and throw her out onto the street right now." Two massive security guards in dark suits moved quickly toward me from the perimeter of the room. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply raised a small black remote control in my right hand and pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive glowing Rogers Aerodynamics logo on the digital display behind the stage vanished. It was immediately replaced by a highly magnified, razor-sharp image of a finalized, deeply complex federal legal document. The bold, undeniable header read, "Iron Sight Limited Liability Company. Notice of immediate patent revocation." The security guards hesitated, confused by the sudden change on the screen. A loud collective gasp rippled rapidly through the audience as high-level corporate attorneys in the crowd immediately recognized the catastrophic legal phrasing. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, the sharp, rhythmic click of my polished heels echoing loudly against the marble floor. "You cannot sell this company, Preston," I stated loudly, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority, "because you do not actually own anything of value. You are merely attempting to sell a hollow, worthless shell." "You are completely insane," Beatrice shrieked from the stage. Her carefully crafted, elegant facade shattering entirely. She gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles turning bone white. "Turn that screen off immediately. She is a fired, disgruntled employee having a psychotic break. Read the document." "Beatrice," I commanded coldly, stopping 10 feet away from the stage. I looked directly at the foreign contractors who were now staring at the screen in absolute terrifying confusion. Rogers Aerodynamics does not own a single core patent for the stealth telemetry systems, the turbine blueprints, or the navigation algorithms. My grandfather legally stripped the company of all its intellectual property exactly 5 years ago. Rogers Aerodynamics is strictly a tenant, a lessee. They rent the technology from the actual owner. I paused, letting the crushing weight of the reality settle over the room before delivering the final fatal blow. "And I am the sole registered chief executive officer of Ironsight. As of precisely 6 o'clock this evening, all licensing agreements have been permanently revoked. If you sign that contract today, gentlemen, you are paying $1 billion for a collection of empty office chairs and a very nice coffee machine." The lead foreign contractor's face turned a violent, dark shade of purple. He shot up out of his chair, slamming his fists down hard on the mahogany table. He looked at Preston with pure, unfiltered, murderous intent. "You lied to us," the contractor roared, his thick accent snapping through the air. "You swore you had full legal clearance. This is a complete fraud. The deal is entirely dead." The foreign men aggressively shoved their chairs back, violently grabbing their briefcases. They stormed off the stage and shoved their way through the panicked, murmuring crowd, desperately trying to escape the disaster. Preston was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the chaotic room as his entire stolen empire rapidly disintegrated into dust right in front of him. He grabbed the gold pen and threw it violently across the stage. "I will destroy you for this, Mia," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. "I will tie you up in court for the next 40 years. I will bleed you absolutely dry. We will sue you for every single penny you have ever touched," Beatrice howled, stepping forward. Her face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. "You are nothing. You are a mistake." "Save your breath for the federal judge," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom were violently thrown open. The loud, terrifying sound of heavy tactical boots hitting the marble floor instantly silenced the screaming crowd. General Marcus Thorne marched into the room, his dress uniform replaced by a dark, severe federal agency windbreaker. Following closely behind him were a dozen heavily armed federal agents from the Department of Justice, their badges gleaming sharply under the crystal chandelier. They moved with swift, brutal efficiency, cutting straight through the terrified crowd and storming up the steps of the stage. "Preston Rogers," General Thorne announced, his deep, resonant voice echoing with the crushing weight of absolute, inescapable justice. "You are officially under arrest by the order of the federal government for multiple counts of high-level industrial espionage, treasonous conspiracy, and international money laundering." Two agents grabbed Preston firmly by the shoulders, twisting his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Preston collapsed to his knees, his expensive tuxedo instantly ruined completely, sobbing like a terrified, broken child. Beatrice stood frozen in absolute horror, her mouth hanging open in a silent, agonizing scream as she watched her golden child, her perfect son, being physically dragged away toward an unmarked federal prison transport. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaotic, ruined ballroom. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched them fall into the exact, inescapable pit they had so desperately tried to bury me in. 72 hours later, I sat in a perfectly sterile, windowless interrogation room deep inside a federal holding facility. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, leaving me entirely alone with the man who had tormented me for my entire adult life. Preston was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer who had stood on that glittering stage just 3 days prior was entirely gone. He sat slumped under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, wearing a standard-issue, terribly faded orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was a greasy, chaotic mess, and his skin was a sickly pale gray. He was violently trembling. The crushing weight of multiple federal indictments carrying a guaranteed sentence of consecutive life terms in a maximum security prison had thoroughly broken his mind. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen from endless hours of desperate weeping. "Mia," he croaked, his voice cracking pitifully. He leaned forward, rattling the heavy steel chains that bound his wrists to the metal table. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will give you everything. The money, the properties, the titles. Just call off the federal prosecutors. We are blood, Mia. I am your brother. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I looked at his pathetic, begging face and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no sorrow. Just a profound, quiet emptiness. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the old, battered pilot's watch. I placed it gently on the cold metal table between us, the shattered glass catching the harsh overhead light. "You never understood him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed heavily in the small concrete room. "You thought Grandfather was a fool for leaving you the entire corporation while giving me a piece of garbage." Preston stared at the watch, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Grandfather did not leave the corporation to me because he loved me the most." I continued, my tone hardening into solid ice. "He left it to me because he knew I was the exact opposite of you. He knew I was the only person in this entire family who would dare to personally send his ruined, corrupt eldest grandson to federal prison to protect what is right." I stood up, sliding the heavy metal chair back. Preston began to hyperventilate, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to come back, as I turned and knocked firmly on the steel door. The guard opened it immediately. I walked out into the bright hallway, leaving the agonizing sounds of my brother's total destruction locked securely behind me. The subsequent fallout was absolutely massive, but highly surgical. With General Thorne's direct backing, I aggressively purged Rogers Aerodynamics of every single corrupt executive and board member who had enabled Preston's treason. I officially merged the cleansed corporate entity with Ironsight Limited Liability Company, completely restructuring the organization from the ground up. Within 6 months, we signed a massive, entirely transparent technology contract directly with the United States Department of Defense, permanently securing our national security assets. As for my mother, Beatrice, the federal courts were exceptionally thorough. Because her multi-billion-dollar real estate inheritance was intricately tied to Preston's fraudulent corporate leverage, the government seized absolutely everything under the criminal forfeiture laws. The designer gowns, the imported cars, the luxury penthouses were all auctioned off to pay back the victims of the international fraud. For the first time in her 65 years of life, Beatrice Rogers was forced to experience the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class. I completely severed all financial ties with her. I did not give her a single dime. The last I heard, the former queen of Seattle high society was working 40 hours a week as a junior receptionist at a budget dental clinic, forced to smile politely and endure the grueling labor required to earn every single penny she needed to survive. I stood quietly in my new sprawling corner office overlooking the beautiful Seattle skyline. The morning sun was bright, cutting warmly through the rain clouds. I held the pilot's watch in my hands. I had paid a master horologist to completely restore it. The deep scratches in the metal casing were polished smooth, the shattered glass was replaced with pristine crystal, and the rusted internal gears were painstakingly rebuilt. I slowly turned the winding crown between my thumb and forefinger. I held the cold metal close to my ear, closing my eyes. I listened to the steady rhythmic ticking of the newly revived machinery. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute justice. I have learned that sometimes the most perfect revenge is not destroying your opponents with violence. Instead, you let them step into the exact pit their own boundless greed dug, while you stand at the edge calmly looking down. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.